This is the smartest AI in the world. Some of these things are just worth repeating. Like Grok 4 is PhD level in everything.
The gold standard, the benchmark testing for artificial general intelligence.
In 1945, an Egyptian farmer digging in a field near a cliff face pulled up a sealed clay jar. Inside were 13 leather-bound books. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd threw a rock into a cave and heard something shatter. What shattered was a clay jar containing scrolls that had been sitting in the dark for 2,000 years. Both finds changed the study of the Bible permanently. What took decades longer to change was who got to decide what the finds actually meant. The jar in the field. The farmer's name was Muhammad Ali al-Samman. He was digging near the base of a cliff at a site called Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, looking for soft soil to use as fertilizer. What he found instead was a large sealed ceramic jar, approximately a meter tall. The accounts of what happened next vary in their details, but the broad outline is consistent. He broke the jar open, found the leather-bound books inside, brought them home, and his mother used some of the loose papyrus pages as fuel for the cooking fire before anyone understood what was in her hands. What survived the fire and the subsequent weeks of confusion and trading between local dealers and eventually reached the attention of scholars was a collection of 45 separate texts, bound into 13 codices, written in Coptic on papyrus that had been sealed in that jar since approximately the 4th century CE. The texts themselves were older than the manuscripts. They were translations into Coptic of documents originally written in Greek, some of which scholars believe date to the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, overlapping with the period in which the canonical New Testament documents were being written and circulated. The Nag Hammadi Library, as the collection came to be called, contained texts that the mainstream Christian tradition had not included in its canon. Some of them had been mentioned by early church writers, usually in the context of condemning them. Several had been assumed lost: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, the Apocryphon of John. These were not unknown names in the history of early Christianity. They were names attached to texts that the tradition had decided, in the process of canon formation, did not belong in the authoritative collection. The jar in the field brought them back, and what they said, when scholars finally worked through them, demonstrated that the early Christian world was significantly more diverse in its understanding of Jesus, his teachings, and the nature of spiritual life than the canonical texts alone had suggested. The question of who controlled access to this discovery in the years following 1945 is where the story becomes more complicated than a simple tale of archaeological good fortune. The discovery reshaped scholarly understanding of early Christian diversity and transmission, showing that ancient religious texts often survived through accident, loss, and recovery, rather than continuous institutional preservation alone within fragmented historical contexts over time globally. What happened to the texts after the find? The Nag Hammadi codices did not move quickly from the field to the scholarly community. They moved slowly, through a series of transactions and complications that kept most of the texts out of the hands of researchers for more than 2 decades after their discovery. The Egyptian government eventually acquired most of the collection and placed it under the authority of the Coptic Museum in Cairo. A committee was established to oversee the scholarly editing and publication of the texts. The committee process was slow. Access to the physical manuscripts was restricted. Researchers who were not part of the official committee could not work directly with the texts. Publication of the complete collection did not happen until 1977, 32 years after the jar was opened. The reasons for the delay were a combination of political complications involving the Egyptian government, institutional disputes among scholars over publishing rights, and the simple practical difficulty of organizing a large international scholarly project with limited resources. There was no single decision by a single authority to suppress the texts. The delay was the product of bureaucratic friction, academic competition, and the kind of institutional slowness that large scholarly projects routinely experience. But the effect of the delay was real regardless of its causes. For 30 years, texts that had significant implications for the understanding of early Christianity were available to a small number of researchers and inaccessible to the broader scholarly community and the general public. The picture of Christian origins that reached popular and religious culture during those 30 years was shaped by canonical sources alone. When the Nag Hammadi texts finally became widely available, the picture they added to was already firmly established in most people's understanding. The contrast between the restricted access during those decades and the richness of what the texts contained is what the scholar Elaine Pagels documented in her 1979 book on the Gnostic Gospels, a work that brought the significance of the Nag Hammadi library to a general audience for the first time, and demonstrated, in terms that non-specialists could follow, exactly how much the delayed publication had cost the public conversation about Christian origins. The Dead Sea Scrolls followed a similar pattern, on a longer timeline and with consequences that were in some respects more significant. The Cave and the Scrolls. The Bedouin shepherd Muhammad ed-Dib is traditionally credited with the 1947 discovery of what would become the Dead Sea Scrolls. Near the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, he threw a stone into a cave and heard pottery break. Inside were clay jars containing 7 scrolls wrapped in linen. The manuscripts were taken out of the desert and passed through traders in Bethlehem, and eventually reached scholars in Jerusalem, where their significance began to emerge. Systematic surveys of nearby cliffs around Qumran revealed 11 caves containing fragments from roughly 900 manuscripts. These texts, collectively known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, include the oldest surviving copies of most books of the Hebrew Bible, in some cases 1,000 years older than previously known versions. They also include sectarian writings, community rules, hymns, apocalyptic works, biblical commentaries, and other texts associated with a Jewish community living in the region before the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Paleographic analysis and radiocarbon dating placed many manuscripts between the 3rd century BCE and 1st century CE. The arid desert environment preserved parchment and papyrus unusually well, allowing ink, scribal corrections, and multiple hands to be studied in detail. The texts appear in Hebrew, Aramaic, and occasional Greek, reflecting a multilingual literary culture. The collection transformed understanding of ancient Judaism and biblical transmission, showing that scriptural texts existed in multiple forms and that religious life in the Second Temple period was far more diverse than previously assumed. Scholars gained rare insight into how sacred texts were copied, interpreted, and preserved. This material also forced scholars to reconsider the development of the biblical canon, revealing competing textual traditions that coexisted rather than a single stabilized version. Variants across manuscripts illuminated the fluidity of scriptural transmission in antiquity. After the 1947 Arab-Israeli War, the scroll fragments were divided between Israeli and Jordanian custody, creating parallel systems of control and scholarly access in Jerusalem and beyond. A small international editorial team assigned to the Jordanian material maintained exclusive access for decades, limiting outside study and slowing publication of key fragments. Over time, criticism led to broader access and full publication. The scrolls reshaped scholarship on ancient religion and remain one of archaeology's most significant discoveries. Continuing discoveries and digitization efforts now make the collection widely accessible to researchers worldwide. They continue to be studied using advanced imaging techniques and digital reconstruction methods by scholars worldwide in universities' research institutes. The Scrolls Cartel. The scholars assigned to edit the Cave 4 material were legitimate researchers with relevant expertise. The project they were given was genuinely difficult. The Cave 4 fragments were in poor condition, thousands of small pieces of deteriorated leather and papyrus that had to be photographed, sorted, matched to other fragments, and then transcribed and translated. The editorial work required was substantial. But the pace of publication was not simply a reflection of the difficulty of the work. The team published fragments slowly, assigned different texts to different members who worked on them independently and on their own schedules, and maintained the exclusive access arrangement that prevented any other scholar from working on the unpublished material. By the 1980s, decades after the initial find, the majority of the Cave 4 texts remained unpublished and inaccessible to the broader scholarly community. The arguments made by team members for the slowness of publication centered on scholarly thoroughness, the importance of getting the work right before releasing it. Critics argued that the thoroughness argument did not explain why independent scholars could not be given access to the original photographs of the fragments while the official team worked. It was the photographs that were being restricted, not just the physical fragments. A researcher who could not access the photographs could not check the team's work, could not propose alternative readings of ambiguous text, could not identify connections between Cave 4 fragments and other known texts. The exclusive access arrangement was not just controlling the pace of publication, it was controlling the interpretation. The speculation that grew up around the restricted access was significant and, in retrospect, somewhat ironic. In the absence of information about what the unpublished texts actually contained, theories circulated about what the team might be suppressing, content that challenged the origins of Christianity, evidence that undermined the uniqueness of Jesus, material that would embarrass religious authorities. The speculation was more dramatic than the reality. When the restriction finally broke open, when a researcher named Herschel Shanks published a complete set of photographs of the unpublished fragments in 1991, ending the exclusive access arrangement by making the visual record available to everyone, what the Cave 4 texts turned out to contain was significant and interesting, without being the explosive suppressed revelation that 4 decades of restricted access had led people to imagine. The texts were Jewish, not Christian. They predated Christianity and had nothing directly to say about Jesus. What they documented was the richness and diversity of Jewish religious thought in the period immediately before and during the emergence of Christianity, demonstrating that the world that produced Jesus was more theologically varied, more apocalyptically oriented, and more engaged with questions about divine intermediaries and hidden knowledge than the standard picture of first-century Judaism had suggested. This context mattered for understanding Christian origins, but it mattered in the way that good historical context always matters, by complicating simple narratives and requiring more precise and careful thinking. It did not overturn anything, it deepened everything. The lesson of the Scrolls controversy was not that powerful interests had suppressed dangerous content. It was that restricted access to primary historical sources damages the quality of historical understanding, feeds speculation that exceeds what the evidence supports, and serves the interests of the restricted group rather than the interests of knowledge. The scrolls were not suppressed because they were dangerous. They were restricted because the scholars controlling them wanted to publish them on their own terms and in their own time. The effect on public understanding was damaging, regardless of the intention. The Gospel of Judas. The Gospel of Judas surfaced in the Egyptian antiquities market in the 1970s and spent the following 3 decades in conditions that came close to destroying it permanently. The manuscript was a Coptic codex that had been removed from its original find site, probably a burial site in the Egyptian desert, without archaeological documentation. It entered the illegal antiquities trade, passed through the hands of multiple dealers, was stored in a bank vault in New York for 16 years, and during that time deteriorated significantly due to temperature fluctuations and improper handling. By the time it reached a foundation that arranged for its proper conservation and scholarly analysis in the early 2000s, portions of it had crumbled and would never be recovered. What survived was conserved, photographed, and analyzed by a team of scholars assembled by the National Geographic Society. The text was identified as a version of the Gospel of Judas, a text that had been mentioned by the early church writer Irenaeus in approximately 180 CE in the context of condemning it as a heretical fabrication. Irenaeus described it as teaching that Judas was not a betrayer, but a specially chosen disciple who carried out Jesus' instructions in handing him over to the authorities. The text he was condemning had been lost for nearly 2,000 years. The Coptic Codex was a version of it. The National Geographic team published its initial translation and analysis in 2006 with significant media attention. The publication described the text as presenting Judas in a positive light, as the disciple who understood Jesus' true message better than the others, and who was chosen specifically to assist in the liberation of Jesus' spirit from his physical body. The presentation was dramatic, and the media coverage was extensive. The implication that one of Christianity's central villains had been misrepresented for 2,000 years was a story that traveled widely. What came next was less widely covered. A group of scholars who examined the translation produced by the National Geographic team identified significant problems with specific passages. The Coptic language of the manuscript was difficult. Portions were damaged, some words were ambiguous, and the theological framework of the text was unfamiliar enough that choices made in translation had large effects on the meaning of specific passages. The most significant dispute centered on a word that the National Geographic translation had rendered in a way that made Judas appear spiritually elevated. Other scholars argued that the same word in context carried a negative meaning, suggesting that the text was not praising Judas but condemning him from within its own theological framework. The scholarly debate that followed was technical and detailed, and did not receive the same media attention as the initial publication. The consensus that emerged from it was that the National Geographic translation had overstated the positive portrayal of Judas, and that the text was more ambiguous and more negative in its treatment of him than the initial presentation suggested. The Gospel of Judas remained a significant and genuine ancient text, representing an early Christian perspective outside the canonical tradition. It was not the simple rehabilitation of Judas that the initial coverage had described. The story of the Gospel of Judas is not a story of suppression. It is a story of a genuine ancient text nearly destroyed by the illegal antiquities trade, partially damaged beyond recovery by improper storage, and then partially misrepresented in its initial scholarly presentation. A combination of real loss and interpretive overreach that produced a public understanding less accurate than the evidence supported. The Codex Sinaiticus. The Codex Sinaiticus is one of the oldest complete manuscripts of the Christian Bible in existence. It was produced in the 4th century CE, probably in Egypt or Palestine, and it contains the entire New Testament along with most of the Old Testament in Greek. It is one of the most important documents in the history of biblical scholarship. The story of its discovery and the textual variants it contains tells a more significant story about the history of the biblical text than any of the allegedly suppressed texts discussed above. The manuscript was found at St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of Mount Sinai in the 19th century by a German scholar named Constantin von Tischendorf. The details of how Tischendorf obtained the manuscript from the monastery, whether he borrowed it legitimately, was given it as a gift, or effectively took it without proper authorization, have been disputed between scholars and the monastery for more than a century. The manuscript is now held partly at the British Library in London, partly at the Leipzig University Library, partly at the Russian National Library, and partly still at St. Catherine's. The division is itself a product of the complicated history of its removal from the monastery. What the Codex Sinaiticus contains, in textual terms, is what matters most for understanding the history of the biblical text. It contains thousands of differences from the standard text of the Bible that most modern readers encounter. The majority of these differences are minor: variations in spelling, small grammatical differences, the kind of variation that occurs across any manuscript tradition, but some of them are significant. The Gospel of Mark in the Codex Sinaiticus ends at chapter 16, verse 8. The women who come to the tomb on the morning of the resurrection find the tomb empty, encounter a young man in white who tells them Jesus has risen, and flee in fear. The text stops there. The 12 verses that follow in most modern Bibles, the post-resurrection appearances, the command to preach to all nations, the signs that will follow believers, are not present. Neither are they present in the other oldest manuscripts of Mark. This is not a minor textual variant. The ending of Mark is one of the most studied questions in New Testament scholarship, and the consensus of the field is that the longer ending was not original to the Gospel. It was added later, probably in the 2nd century, by someone who felt that the abrupt ending at verse 8 was insufficient and wanted to provide a more complete conclusion that matched the resurrection appearance accounts in the other Gospels. The Codex Sinaiticus preserves the older, shorter ending. Most Bibles include the longer ending while noting in a footnote that the earliest manuscripts do not contain it. The story of the longer ending of Mark is not a story of suppression. It is a story of the normal processes by which ancient texts were copied, modified, and transmitted, processes that produced a manuscript tradition with real internal variation that scholarly analysis can identify and map. The Codex Sinaiticus is valuable precisely because it is old enough to preserve an earlier stage of that tradition, before some of the later additions and modifications were made. The Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is the most discussed of the Nag Hammadi texts, and the one with the most direct relevance to the study of Jesus' teachings. It contains 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, with no narrative, no miracle accounts, no passion story, and no resurrection account. Just sayings. Some of them are close to or identical with sayings found in the canonical Gospels. Others have no parallel in the canonical texts. The question that has occupied scholars since Thomas became available is whether it preserves independent early traditions about Jesus' teachings, whether some of the sayings it contains go back to sources as old as or older than the sources used by the canonical Gospels, or whether it is a later compilation drawing on the canonical Gospels and reshaping their material through a different theological lens. The scholarly debate on this question has not produced a clean consensus. The majority view among specialists in the field is that Thomas is a complex document, probably compiled in the late 1st or early 2nd century, containing a mixture of material that may preserve early independent traditions alongside material that appears to be dependent on the canonical Gospels and shaped by the theological concerns of the community that produced it. This view does not allow for a simple statement about whether Thomas is early or late, authentic or derivative. It requires holding both possibilities simultaneously and working through each saying individually. What Thomas does, regardless of its precise date and sources, is demonstrate something important about the diversity of early Christianity. The community or communities that produced Thomas understood Jesus' teaching primarily as wisdom, as sayings that conveyed hidden knowledge about the nature of reality and the self, rather than as proclamations about an imminent kingdom of God or a saving death and resurrection. This is a different emphasis from the canonical Gospels, and it was clearly present in some parts of the early Christian world, clearly connected to the same tradition, and clearly distinct enough from the emerging mainstream that it did not survive the process of canon formation. The canon formation process was not a single event and not a single decision. It was a gradual convergence over several centuries, during which different texts circulated in different communities with different degrees of authority, and the boundaries of the authoritative collection shifted as the institutional church developed, and the theological debates of each period shaped which texts were treated as foundational. The Gospel of Thomas ended up outside that collection not because a single authority banned it at a single moment, but because the community that valued it most did not survive the theological controversies of the 2nd and 3rd centuries in a form that could influence the broader tradition. The jar in the field at Nag Hammadi preserved it anyway. What the real manuscripts show. The picture that emerges from the actual ancient manuscript evidence, from Nag Hammadi, from the Dead Sea Scrolls, from the Codex Sinaiticus, from the Gospel of Judas, from decades of papyrus discoveries in Egypt, is not the picture that dramatic suppression narratives describe. The real picture is more interesting and more complicated than any single suppressed passage could provide. It is a picture of a first-century Jewish world that was theologically diverse, apocalyptically oriented, and engaged with questions about divine wisdom and hidden knowledge in ways that shaped the environment in which Christianity emerged. It is a picture of early Christianity that was significantly more varied in its understanding of Jesus than the canonical texts alone suggest. A world in which multiple communities, drawing on overlapping but not identical sources, developed different emphases and different practices that were genuinely connected to the same foundational events and teachings. It is a picture of a canon formation process that was gradual, contested, and shaped by historical, political, and theological factors, a process that included genuine decisions about which texts served the needs of the emerging institutional church and which did not, and that resulted in a collection that preserved some early traditions and left others outside its boundaries. The texts left outside are not secretly superior to the texts inside. They are different. And the difference is informative about the range of ways that the early Christian world understood what it had received. The manuscript tradition of the texts that were included also shows variation, real, documented variation that affects specific passages in ways that scholars have been studying for 2 centuries, and that modern Bible translations reflect in their footnotes. The longer ending of Mark. The story of the woman caught in adultery in John, which is absent from the oldest manuscripts. The comma in 1 John that explicitly states the Trinity doctrine, which appears in no Greek manuscript before the 15th century and is not present in most modern translations. These are not suppressed revelations. They are well-documented features of the manuscript tradition that any reader with access to a good critical edition of the Bible can examine directly. The real story of what the ancient manuscripts show is available. It is in academic libraries and increasingly in online databases. The Codex Sinaiticus is fully digitized and publicly accessible. The Nag Hammadi texts are published in multiple scholarly editions and numerous popular translations. The Dead Sea Scrolls are available in complete photographic and text editions. The Gospel of Judas is published with its full scholarly apparatus. None of this material is hidden. Some of it is difficult, and all of it requires careful reading. But difficulty is not suppression, and careful reading is not a barrier erected by powerful interests. It is what the evidence requires. Why this matters now. The reason the manuscript evidence matters for readers in the present is not because it reveals a secret that overturns everything previously understood. It matters because it shows the process by which the texts that shaped Western civilization were produced, transmitted, and selected, a process that was human, historical, and contingent in ways that a view of the Bible as a single, uniformly authoritative, perfectly preserved text does not easily accommodate. Understanding that process does not require abandoning faith in the significance of the texts. It requires a more precise and more historically grounded understanding of what kind of documents they are and how they came to be in the form they are in. The Codex Sinaiticus shows an earlier stage of the biblical text that differs in specific ways from the standard text. That difference is not a threat to the text's significance. It is information about the history of a document that has shaped more lives than any other in the Western tradition. The Nag Hammadi texts show that early Christians were thinking about Jesus and his teachings in more varied ways than the canonical tradition alone suggests. That variation does not invalidate the canonical tradition. It places it in a context that makes it more comprehensible as a historical phenomenon and more interesting as a theological one. The decisions made during canon formation were real decisions, made by real people with real limitations and real stakes in the outcomes. Understanding those decisions as human decisions made in specific historical circumstances is different from understanding the resulting canon as an accident or a fraud. The Dead Sea Scrolls show a Jewish world in the period immediately surrounding the emergence of Christianity that was theologically richer and more complex than the standard picture assumed. That complexity is the context in which Jesus taught and in which the first Christians understood what they had received. It does not reduce the significance of what followed. It explains more precisely what it grew out of. The manuscripts are real. The history they document is real. The picture they produce is more complicated than dramatic suppression narratives and more significant than the simple story of a perfectly preserved sacred text. It is the actual history of the most influential set of documents in the Western world, and it is available to anyone willing to look at it carefully. A farmer found a jar in a field. A shepherd threw a rock into a cave. A scholar carried a manuscript from a monastery. Across decades, those finds reshaped how we read ancient texts and how we understand their transmission. The manuscripts are real, preserved, and open to study. The story is not suppression, but complexity, accident, and careful scholarship. If you want more deep dives into the archive, subscribe.